now it's time to move from the esoteric to something a little more practical. While there isn't much resistance to the idea that characters in video games are reflections of the general attitudes of the developers and the society they live in general, we should ask the question, and this question really isn't asked very often, of course. What can we learn about how men and women relate to each other and themselves when it comes to video games? And I think we can learn quite a lot. Just the other day, I was working on this part of the video when I read an article about the need for more diversity and inclusion in video games. If it's true that video games are a mirror of society in certain respects, like movies, TV, and books, then it seems like the public discourse is lacking a certain perspective. And I hope that we can begin to introduce this perspective in an effective way through video games. I expect some people will strongly disagree with my perspective on this, but I believe that much of the discussions about inclusion and diversity in games resolve themselves if we can understand why it is we find ourselves having this discussion in the first place. In order to frame my perspective properly, let's start at the very beginning of video games with this man. This is Ralph Baer, a German-born immigrant who in 1966 started playing around with the idea of putting something on his television screen that he could interact with. Baer was the developer of the very first gaming console, known as the Magnavox Odyssey, in 1972. You thought Atari was the first console. I didn't even realize until I researched this. I didn't realize it was released in 72. The console was a big hit for Magnavox, and it earned that company over $100 million over the several different iterations. So this was a big hit, needless to say. Now, masculine and feminine have an orientation to each other in the universe as nothingness and everythingness, respectively. So the masculine would be the nothingness, the Shiva, and the feminine would be the everythingness, or the Shakti. I like using Shiva and Shakti as a more human and relatable way of explaining this energy dynamic. In order to fully appreciate this perspective, we have to see that masculine and feminine are oriented to each other in such a way which relates to the very nature of our self-perpetuating reality. The masculine, or Lord Shiva, energy dwells primarily in the unattached realm of the metaphysical, unemotional, cold, calculated, analytical. Metaphysical. That's the masculine. While the feminine, or Shakti energy, dwells primarily in the attached realm of the physical, right? Physical, sensual, nature. That's the Shakti. That's the feminine. The very same, and by the way, this image here of Shiva and Shakti, if you look at this image, it's Shiva and Shakti again. It's the exact same image. The very same energetic properties of masculine and feminine found within the human male and female are to be found in all things within our universe. Shiva, or the masculine aspect, is the emptiness. He's the vastness of space that we see here, the nothingness, right? It's that which makes all things possible to exist in the first place. It's all of these. So think of Shiva as standing. Now, of course, if you look at this image, Shiva stands behind Shakti always. Go look for images of Shiva and Shakti, or Shiva and Parvati. If you look, it's always, Shiva is always standing behind, right? Because he's the empty space, he's the nothingness, he's the void. And so if you look at space here, what's really behind everything is this emptiness, this void, this void of space, right? All of the stars are the feminine physical manifestation of nature, but they wouldn't have space, and you wouldn't have anything to put these stars in. You wouldn't have anything to put it in if you didn't have Shiva. And also there's a balancing, it's a very interesting balancing happening with Shiva and Shakti here. Shiva has the crescent moon in his hair, and he's got a bit of the feminine, and the Shakti is wearing this golden headdress, right? And it's akin to the sun. So there's some masculine here. It's we could go on forever with this image here. So this is also Shiva and Shakti. Okay, so think of space and Shiva, the void, or the all-encompassing space that everything can be put in. Now Shakti, or the feminine aspect of this universal energy, is everythingness. It's the manifested nature which springs forth from seemingly nowhere, eventually returning. Of course, it returns to the same place where the eternal cycle can continue. Things are born, they come into this world, they grow, they die, there's entropy, things then just kind of dissipate, right? All things that come from Shiva return to Shiva. The fundamental dynamic of our universe is this, essentially. It's just this, right? It's this creation and destruction, to simplify it. The fundamental dynamic of our universe is something that occurs without any attachment, without any value judgment. It just does what it does. It doesn't consult any kind of emotional or logical thought-based rule book or anything. It doesn't need that. It just does what it does. And we're part of that, actually. Of course, we have cognizance, we have minds, and that's what we use to tie ourselves into knots. So I'm going to try to untie this whole masculine and feminine relation part of it. The domain of the masculine. Now, let's get back to Ralph Baer, because you're thinking, well, why did we see an image of him earlier? The domain of the masculine dwells in this place, in the conceptual, the intangible, the nothingness of abstract thought. Because this console just started with a thought by Mr. Baer, right? It was just a thought. It wasn't anything in reality. It was just kind of just a phantom, right? Whereas the feminine domain dwells in the actual. The feminine is tangible. The feminine is the manifest world. It's everything. It is the physical. So it should be no surprise that it is the masculine energy which conceives of such impractical and unrealistic things, like a machine that puts objects under one's control on a TV screen, called the Odyssey. And yet, when such a metaphysical and masculine idea, that's a guy thing. I mean, let's be honest. A guy sitting around, an electronics engineer, right? And the electronics engineer thinks, I can put something on a screen and move it around. Could have easily been a woman, but that woman would have been strong in her analytical, which is her masculine. She would have been strong. She would have been very strong in her abstract, conceptual, analytical side. And that would have been for her masculine. So it doesn't really matter that it's a man. It could have been a woman strong in her analytical masculine. But the point is, this is a masculine energy that comes up with this idea, right? And that is exactly commensurate with, that is related to the nothingness, the metaphysical nature of the masculine energy versus the physical nature of the feminine. So what happens when Ralph Baer puts this idea, takes this as a metaphysical being, if you will, or a metaphysical construct, he takes it from an idea and he turns it into a reality. This is where the masculine meets the feminine, right? And so when a metaphysical and masculine idea manifests in the world of the physical, this is like the one side of the energy meeting the other, right? The masculine meeting the feminine. When this happens, when an idea comes into reality, all sorts of new possibilities arise. And when this idea meets with the real world, or the feminine, the physical or feminine energy, the possibilities at that point, I don't think Baer could ever have possibly, in fact, this creator of the video game could never have imagined, once his idea came into physical reality, he never could have imagined what would happen next and where it would go, because the feminine takes it in a different direction, right? You can't conceptualize. It's like thinking about something in your mind that you're going to do, and then you do it, but it happens totally differently, right? When the rubber meets the road, when you're in a physical reality and you try to do something that maybe in your head you thought it was going to go down a certain way, it's completely different, right? And yet it also still has that same flavor of that metaphysical idea. That idea is still there. It just manifests in a different way. So this unity creates a novel. It creates novelty, I should say. It creates novelty in the universe, and that novelty is what makes things interesting, keeps things fresh, and keeps things going, right? And yet, here we find ourselves, men and women, both steeped in value judgments about each other. Now, this isn't the case with everyone, but there are extremists on either side, I would say. So if it is true that who or what we are is integrally linked to the laws of the universe, which I certainly tend to think so, and those laws and everything we understand about nature is met with human astonishment without judgment, then the human value judgments we impose on ourselves and each other only serve to ignore a certain truth about who we are. The value judgments we experience are typically a masculine or metaphysical creation born from the imbalanced state we find ourselves living in today, because our society is essentially imbalanced towards the masculine. That's not a big secret. The good news is that this masculine imbalance is merely a construct of belief systems which are metaphysical or masculine in nature. So while manifestations of this imbalance can be seen everywhere in our world, it is only from a wrongful understanding in the mind where it has come into being in any form. The masculine may conceive of this or that, but it takes the feminine for it to manifest and take shape. And if the conception is ill-founded, if the idea is not a good idea, it will be proven to be so by how it manifests in the domain of the feminine form of physical reality. Once this is understood, it is easy to see imbalance happening in our world.